Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Ah, right, well, I don't know which one I clicked. Ah, right, well, I don't know which one I clicked. If I click desktop audio, can you hear me now? If I click desktop audio, so must be video capture device. Video capture device. You can hear me. Test. Test. Okay, right. So there is about a 5 or 6 second delay or something. Okay. So, okay, right. So there is about. Hello. You can see me. Okay, right. So there is about. So, okay, right. So there is about. Hello. You can see me. Speak closer to the mic. Is that better? If I round that one up. Speak closer to the mic. I haven't got a clue which buttons do what. If I round that one up. Speak closer to the mic. Can you still hear me? Clue which buttons do what. Can you still hear me? Clue which buttons do what. Fantastic. Should we make a start? Fantastic. Should we make a start? Fantastic. Should we make a start? Okay, so if you want to ask questions as I'm going through the PowerPoint and give you some information, feel free. It's probably best if you want to ask questions because there is a delay, so I can't necessarily respond to something unless I see it. It's probably best. So year revision, what I've tried to do is include what Max wanted, which is how to answer different questions, and I'll go through some examples before right at the end covering some content, some of the trickier content. We're only going to look at the war in Afghanistan and the impact with Osama bin Laden. So, starting off, 4th of June, AM, we've got our paper 1. Paper 2 is on the 8th of June, which is the Friday, which is migration. And then paper 3, which is the 12th of June, which is Empire and Boottown. And then paper 3, which is the 12th of June, which is Empire and Boottown. I think I've closed down YouTube so it doesn't repeat. So as you can see, I've also included the timings on there. Paper 1, we've got 1 hour and 45 minutes. Hello, Daniel. Paper 2, we've got an hour, which is migration to Britain. So that's the unit that we've covered most recently, Purple Book. And then the third one is Boottown, where we know we can guarantee some marks, and Empire. Paper 1, 1 hour long. Paper 1 is 1 hour 45, but the first section is international relations, the second section is Weimar Republic. So you've got a 5 marker, which is a simple outline, so a description of one thing. Outline, you give 1 or 2 simple points. Your 10 mark is your explain, which is 10 marks. Is it still echoing? And then your question 3 and question 4 is interpretations. So we can guarantee that the interpretations are going to be on the Cold War, or they're going to be on appeasement. So we can guarantee. All with me so far? Or they're going to be on appeasement. So we can guarantee. All with me so far? How about now? Can you still hear me? How about now? Can you still hear me? How about now? Can you still hear me? Max, don't. Max, don't. Right. A few technical issues, but on the work practicing. Right. Good. Technical issues, but so we're going to skip through that. You've already seen this PowerPoint. You know how to answer. So we're going to skip through that. Comment. Have to talk about historical time. You know how to answer. So we're going to skip through that. Comment. Or have to talk 60s historical time. You know how to answer. Vietnam. About the 90s. 60s historical time. Vietnam. If we're talking about an appeasement pact about the 90s, fighting start of World. If we're talking about an appeasement pact about the 90s, fighting start of war that they're trying. If we're talking about an appeasement pact about the 90s, it's as if they're writing start of war wars trying. It's have to talk about other wars trying. It's have to talk about other actual knowledge. Have to talk about other challenge actual knowledge. I can try muting challenge actual knowledge. I can try muting challenge actual knowledge. I can try muting challenge. I can try muting. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Good. Not nobody typing anything. Good. Not nobody. As I say, you can rewatch the kind of the writing. As I say, you can rewatch the question 4 is slightly different. It's explain why not writing. Read or explain why history. Question 4 is slightly different. You have to show, you know, read or explain why history. Have to compare them to each. You have to show, you know, read or explain this. Have to compare them to each. How interpretations change. Explain what happened. Now, this is the type of have to compare them to each. How interpretations change. Explain what happened. Now, this is the type of first part period, you know, oh, why it's like that and how that is this part period, you know, visionist. Oh, why it's like writing that and how that is this part period, you know, visionist. Oh, question 4, question 3 and question 4, question 3 and much as you can guarantee it's question 4, question 3 and a bit silly of OCR. Huge amount actually what question 4, question 3 and a bit silly not as much best amount giving you some bit silly and then best amount giving you some I've got an answer here and then best amount giving you some I've got an answer here and then now for the second half of that paper it's an hour and 40. Second half is Germany. That's what we started. Now for the second half of that paper, it's an hour and 40. Second half is Germany. That's what we started. Now for the second, so you get a 2 marker. Describe 1. Second half is Germany. 10 marker. Explain. So you get a 2 marker. Source question. 1 question. Always worth maximum. Explain. Either be 110. 2 question. Ask question. Maximum. Explain. Either be 110. Some examples. Ask question. Describe 1 either be 110. God's sake. Examples. Ask question. Describe 1 either be 110. God's sake. Examples. Ask question. Describe 1 God's sake. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I know you can bloody hear me, Max. Is it still dropping out? I know you can bloody hear me, Max. Is it still dropping out? I know you can bloody hear me, Max. Is it still dropping out? I know you can bloody hear me, Max. So, again, I'll put this PowerPoint up on and share it with you so you can go through some of the questions you wanted to. The question 3 will, as I said, will be either worth 110 or 2 5 marks. So here's some types of examples. So it'll either be why was the source published, how is it useful, what's the viewpoint, how reliable, and you always get the same kind of mark scheme. Clear statements of purpose, supported or developed. You have to use this kind of structure for it. So make a judgment, reinforce that with the content, the origin, which is otherwise known as the provenance, and the purpose, and then support it with this historical context, and then reiterate your judgment. So can you see how this is very similar to the Boottown 10 mark? And there's a reason for that. The sources, there's one way to analyse it: content, origin, purpose, which we group together as the provenance, and then to support that with historical context. So for this example, study sources A and B, how are they similar? My judgment is they're similar in content and provenance, but they differ in the purpose, and then I've gone on to explain why I've come to that judgment. I've made sure I've referred to the source, and I've given my answer, and I've reinforced that judgment at the end. So that's kind of the ideal structure for this. So here's one for you, Max. This is a writing frame for every question within Germany, and I'll try and cobble together something for the international relations section as well as migration. So for the second section, 45 minutes, 210, either 2 5s, 110, and then an 18. So the 18 mark is obviously how far you agree, and for that it's nice and simple. You've got to have evidence for both examples, and then you've got to have a conclusion that reinforces the your answer. Now for this second paper, which is just an hour long, which doesn't seem anywhere near enough to answer all of this, you've got a 4 marker, an 8 marker, the 14 and the 24. So remember when we were practicing the 24 and the 14, we really struggled to see the differences between the two. Well, one is just asking for a judgment, whereas the other one is asking for balance, remembering to have both sides of the argument for and against. So the first 4-mark question is describing 2, so describe 2 factors or describe 2 reasons. Your 8 marker, very similar to your 10-mark questions, explain the significance or explain why this happened. Your 14 mark is your judgment, and then the 24 is the balance answer. So some examples here from the recent mock that we did. Question 1, describe 2 of the measures. Question 2, explain the part played. Question 3, how significant was migration? And it will be between the specific dates. So in this case, 1945 and 1981. And then question 4 is kind of your breadth topic, trying to cover as much of the course as possible. And remember, there were so many different ways in which we could approach this. So I've wrote a mark scheme for you. So to get top marks, full explanation, thorough analysis, convincing and substantiated conclusion, and then a range of accurate and relevant knowledge. Now I think what's really important is to have that short introduction where you introduce your judgment. So in this period there was much change, there was a lot of struggle. However, some communities did not struggle, so it's difficult to agree wholly with this statement. Then you've got your argument. Try and use peel or ideal or something similar in the structure. Give an example or 2 that supports the statement. Try and counter that with balance. You've got on the other hand, and then your conclusion. Reinforce that judgment. So here's an introduction that I prepared earlier, one for you. So for example, there was significant migration in the period 1440 to 2010 from Jews to the Huguenots. While there are examples where these groups have failed to assimilate and struggled for acceptance, there's also evidence for successful integration, and there's my judgment. Overall, in this period, groups have struggled for acceptance within British society. And here's an answer. So as you can see, I've tried to break it down for point, evidence, explanation, my deeper analysis, and then a link would go on next to my second paragraph. Thank you, Chris A. Watkins. So have a read through this answer. What do you think? Is it a good answer? Is there anything missing? Let's get a little bit interactive. Daniel, I want to hear from you. Miles, I'd like you to make some comments, as I'm sure you will, and Max and Charlie if he's on. So take a couple of minutes and tell me what you think about this answer. So take a couple of minutes and tell me what you think about this answer. So take a couple of minutes and tell me what you think about this answer. So my evidence is quite strong. I've tried to include specific examples, dates, for example, in 1440. So my evidence the majority of thank you, Max. Dates, for example, in 1440. Thank you, Leon Barker, the little man in the bottom right-hand corner. Thank you. What about the actual answer? Thank you, Leon Barker. So the evidence is obviously 1440. The majority of Jews that still remained in Britain following the expulsion actually, had to hide the fact that they were Jewish. Well, they lived in very small communities. They didn't have the facility to practice, and they didn't certainly have any way in which they could express themselves. That all changed under Cromwell. If you remember, there was the plea from. If you remember, there was I can't remember who it was now, from somebody in order to get them to seek asylum. And so the Jews that came over under Cromwell were there really under asylum. That leads to the Jewish Naturalisation Act being passed in 1753, but there is a lot of revolt from people in England. In fact, from Scotland it never even got passed. So there's clear anti-Semitism within Europe in this period, certainly within Britain as well. My explanation, I could really have developed that a little bit further. It suggests that integrations were hardly easy and supports the statement that they struggled. I could have gone on and elaborated on how they've sort of struggled within this period, but then my analysis is what probably brings it up to the higher mark scheme. However, they were eventually given civil rights in the 1820s, and there are examples of integration. For example, de Rothschild was the first MP who was Jewish, and there are other examples that you could use in that. So if you look back at the mark scheme, there we go. It's got a convincing substantiated judgment. It's got a range of knowledge relevant to the question. It's fully explained, and it's got a thorough analysis present. So on to the next paper, paper 3. You have 1 hour and 15 minutes. So we know we get 30 minutes on Boottown, which is 15 minutes for each 10 marker, but we also have to look at sources within that. And then for paper 3, the first section is the impact of the British Empire. So that'll be an explain question, and it'll be sources. Now you get 3 sources to analyse. Paper 3, the second part, Boottown, 2 10 markers. So we know we're going to have 2 sources. Which one's more useful? That's the one that's been practiced. And then for 10 markers, we've got explain. So before we go on to some content when we're looking at Afghanistan, any questions? So before we go on, thank you, Ben Branch. Afghanistan, any questions? So before we go on, thank you, Ben Branch. No questions from everybody that's here. Nothing. No just questions here having fun. From everybody that's here. Nothing. No just questions here having fun. From everybody that's here. Nothing. No just here having fun. Right. Should we look at Afghanistan? So this is something that you would have covered at the end of year 10. I know it was a little bit rushed as we're sort of approaching the 6 weeks term, but what do you notice about the location of Afghanistan in comparison to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as the USSR? What's that, Miles? Exactly. It's right on the border with a number of USSR countries. So you've got Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, as well as bordering countries that are sort of under the influence of other spheres of influence, Iran, Pakistan, China and India. It's in the Middle East. It's a country that's very diverse, it's very large, it's heavily reliant on oil that we know of today. But in 1979 it undergoes a revolution. It borders USSR countries, and the communist government, who was led by Nur Muhammad Taraki, seizes control of Afghanistan in April 1978. Now, the majority of Afghanis reject the communist government, certainly those that live in the rural areas. They're very conservative, they're very religious, and communism completely disagrees with that. Communism is an atheist movement, it has no need for religion, and so a resistance group known as the Mujahideen form against Iraqi, and they declare a holy war of jihad. They seek sort of assistance from the local Islamic countries that border it, and the Ayatollah Khomeini, who himself has just taken over in Iran, gives him his support, so gives them the support and will offer to have a jihad as well, which means more troops will be supporting the Mujahideen. It is a resistance group, and it is able to sort of subvert what's going on at the time. Now, this is one of the reasons why an Afghan politician called Amin takes over and murders Taraki. Amin seizes control and starts to introduce discussions with the USA. Now, at this point, the USA is pumping money secretly through Pakistan into Afghanistan in an effort for containment and to keep the Afghanistan separate and away from communism. In December 1979, there is no way forward for the USSR. The USSR believe that Amin is a CIA agent, and so they invade. Amin is assassinated, and Barack Kemal is installed as leader. Now, it's very clear very quickly that the only way in which Kemal can keep control is with Soviet troops. It invades in 1979. Kabul is pro-USSR, and he can only maintain support by troops. Now, over 100,000 troops are eventually placed into Afghanistan. Now, the Mujahideen start to use guerrilla tactics to avoid defeat. Now, they're very effective at that. There is sort of very similar to Vietnam for America. The Mujahideen dip in and dip out of local areas, and that causes the USSR to respond with bombing. And there's also reports of napalm attacks as well. It results in over 2.8 million Afghans seeking asylum to Pakistan and a further 1.5 million to Iran. You can see the total devastation that's caused by the Mujahideen guerrilla tactics against the USSR, and of course the USSR's invasion itself. Now, secretly, the Mujahideen are very well supported. They're given over $600 million a year by Saudi Arabia, and the USA are giving aid to Pakistan as well as weapons and training, and that is obviously secretly filtering through to Afghanistan through Pakistan. President Carter at the time starts to do this, and it's increased under Ronald Reagan later in the 1980s. The USA immediately responds to this. President Carter recalls the US ambassador from the USSR, which is a diplomatic nightmare. It's officially the end of the détente. The détente is that period of better relations between the USA and the USSR. The USA refuses to ratify the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 2, which is a signifier that this better relations between the two countries is over. And we've got the extension of containment, which is the announcement of the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine is significant because it says the USA will use force if any country is threatened by communism in the Middle East. Now, also, the USA imposes economic sanctions on the USSR, and in the 1980s, this is really going to bring about the end of the Soviet Union. It's one of the reasons for why the USSR is in such bad state of repair by this period. In 1980, the USA boycott the Olympics, and in 1984, the Russians do the same. The US response includes, the results of this is over 1 million civilian deaths, 90,000 Mujahideen fighters, 18,000 Afghani troops, 15,000 Soviet Union troops, and $20 billion as a total cost. Civil war continues even after the Soviets withdraw in 1979, and it eventually allows the Taliban to take over. In 1987, Gorbachev starts this withdrawal. Don't forget, he's the man that introduces glasnost and perestroika. He believes in a new way of thinking in the USSR. One of his first actions is to end this very costly war in Afghanistan. And he starts opening up the Strategic Arms Reduction talks, the START talks, and eventually signs the Intermediate Nuclear Treaty in 1987, which starts to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that America and the USSR hold. And eventually, in February 1989, they withdraw. So Afghanistan, the causes, where there's a communist takeover in 1979, it's rejected by the Mujahideen. Amin, who takes over after killing off the USSR leader, eventually means that the USSR have no choice but to invade. It leads to over 1 million deaths, 20 billion costs. And it really is the start of Al-Qaeda. Now, you'll all recognise this person. This is Osama bin Laden. He was a very rich Saudi. His father was a billionaire. His father had many wives and over 50 children. He's eventually joining the jihad that's been called in 1979. He goes to fight in Afghanistan as a holy war. He's influenced by Abdullah Assam, and eventually he's exiled from Saudi, and eventually his citizenship's taken away from him. Rural areas of Afghanistan are hugely supportive of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and it allows this group to sort of really develop and become the terrorist organisation that you all know. They build the Al-Qaeda based on their beliefs, a very strong Islamic tradition, very anti-Western. They have very strong leaders in Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden has an excellent university education. He's very intelligent. He uses modern technology very, very well, like the internet, films, etc., videos. They have expert training. The USA actually sent troops into Afghanistan through Pakistan to train the Mujahideen in the Afghanistan war, and that comes back to bite them, really. They're also very well funded. They've got huge support from Saudi Arabia and other places. And it's a franchise. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there isn't one organisation called Al-Qaeda. It's heavily influential. It influences people to commit acts such as the World Trade Center bombing. That isn't somebody who is necessarily a member of Al-Qaeda, but he's heavily influenced by bin Laden and others. Now, in 1998, there's dual attacks on Kenya and Tanzania by the World Islamic Front set up by bin Laden, and in 2000, the bombing of the USS Cole. Now, Kenya and Tanzania result in thousands of injuries and hundreds of deaths, and it's a devastating attack. And again, it's influenced by Al-Qaeda, not necessarily the members themselves being part of it. 9/11 is the result that happens next. In 2001, almost 3,000 people lose their life as a result of Al-Qaeda's attacks in New York. The USA responds with George W. Bush and Tony Blair going into coalition against the war on terror. There's assault in Afghanistan, and very, very quickly the Taliban are clearly no match for the coalition forces. They withdraw to their their rural strongholds, and they're defeated within a few months. There is no location for Osama bin Laden, but he's eventually found a few years down the line and killed by the SEAL team. It's very clear that new measures are needed to defeat this threat in the long term, and it leads to consequences on the war on terror. America and the UK failed to win the hearts and minds of many of Afghans. In the towns, they were far more successful, but in the rural areas, they just didn't understand the strength of conservatism and Islam. They failed to have control. The Taliban still had control of the rural areas. They had increased acts of militancy, which is some of the terrorist attacks that we've seen most recently, and after 2001, increased tensions in Afghanistan and the surrounding Middle East area, and heroin production. Under the period during the Afghanistan war, heroin production really dramatically fell. After this period, it's now responsible for almost 90% of total heroin and other sort of products that's being produced in Afghanistan. So that's a couple of little snippets on what to do for Afghanistan, how it might come up in a question where you've got 5 markers, outline and explain the causes of the war of Afghanistan, and then a 10-mark explain why the Soviet Union failed to succeed in Afghanistan. That's the end of the stream so far. If there are any questions, please feel free to type them and ask now. If you don't, forever hold your peace. Please feel free to type them and ask now. If you don't, forever hold your peace. Oh, sorry, didn't realise that any of that had Um, yeah, Leon, they would ask questions on the Afghan war, so it might be an outline and explain, which is 10 marks, or it might be just a describe question. So what are the causes, what are the events, what are the consequences of it? You could talk about the Carter Doctrine, etc. In terms of consequences of the war on terror, that might just be a simple 10-mark question. I think as it's probably the least well-taught section of the course, I'd imagine they're not going to ask you many questions on it, as it would be a little bit difficult of them. It'd be a bit unfair. There you go, Miles. Get rid of that one. Emma Price, you can go to the timeout. Emma Price, you can go to the timeout. Oh, I thought that was a middle finger, Leon. Sorry. Oh, I thought that was a middle finger, Leon. Sorry. Retract that then. Retract that then. How the Afghanistan war links to it. How the Afghanistan war links to it. So if you think, Miles, up until 1979, America and the USSR have been improving in terms of their relations. From 1967 onwards, we kind of call that period détente, where relations get better. It's the thawing of relations between America and the Soviet Union. What are you screenshotting? So, in terms of Afghanistan in 1979, it's kind of the end of those better relations. So during the détente, I mean, America and Russia played against each other in ping pong. They went to each other's Olympics. They had the Apollo-Soyuz mission in space. They joined together. We've got the SALT I talks. It's the first time the two countries are talking about reducing nuclear weapons. We'll go over the missile crisis as well, Leon. Yep, absolutely. And sorry, Cameron, I don't know why we can hear me twice. I will try and fix it for the next one if we want to do it. So in 1979, at the same time that the USSR invade Afghanistan, you've got the growth of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and Gorbachev coming into power as well. So in terms of America, you've got the Carter Doctrine, which is already a very strong response from Jimmy Carter, and then when Ronald Reagan comes into power, he has even more of a strong stance against the Soviet Union. It's known as the Second Cold War because he, rather than trying to improve things, makes them worse. He purposely antagonizes the Soviet Union. He calls them the evil empire, and he says that they have to basically win the war, the Cold War. Whereas up until that point, previous presidents had kind of now agreed that America and the USSR could coexist. So Ronald Reagan is a very negative person until Gorbachev comes to power. Gorbachev comes to power realizing that the USSR are struggling in the 1980s. They're in a hugely costly war against Afghanistan. They're under huge economic sanctions by the USA and other countries, and they're also struggling with the economy in Eastern Europe as well as the Soviet Union republics, the Soviet republics. So they're kind of in a difficult position. He introduces glasnost, which is an effort to try and make things more open, and perestroika, which restructures the economy. Yeah, we will do Max as well if you want me to go all the way back. So we've got the Soviet Union we've got Gorbachev struggling to kind of keep the Soviet Union together, and he realises by 1987 that the war in Afghanistan has to end. It's very, very similar to America's withdrawal from the Vietnam War as well. There will be an AS. There will be an AS. So that's how it kind of links to the course. It helps bring about the end of the Cold War, but more importantly, it leads to the end of the détente and the Carter Doctrine and economic sanctions. So we kind of see it as like the final line between peaceful relations beforehand, and then now we've got negative relations, and then after that we've got the end of the Cold War under Gorbachev and Reagan. Gorbachev, there's different interpretations. Again, like everything, you've got some Russians that see Gorbachev as somebody that tried to save the USSR, and then of course more moderate people, even with his own factions, believe that he was a terrible leader. There was the coup, the famous coup led by the famous Seven that tried to overthrow him, that was very relatively unsuccessful at that point. Right, any other questions on the Cold War and Afghanistan before we move backwards? Right, any other questions on the Cold War and Afghanistan before we move backwards? Right, any other questions on the Cold War and Afghanistan before we move backwards? Sorry, James, there's nothing that I can do. Sorry, James, there's nothing that I can do. Hello, Mr. O'Regan. Sorry, James, there's nothing that I can do. Right, we'll go all the way back to an outline of paper 1 then. We'll go all the way so back now it's a little bit better, hopefully you'll understand. The first paper is split into 2 parts. So although it's paper 1, it's actually paper 1, international relations and the rise of Germany, which is your breadth. So study over time, international relations, 1945, the end of World War II, the rise of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and then finishing in 1989 and going on until 2001 with the international relations. And then the second section is Germany. So the first part of the paper is 1 hour long. It's split into a 5 mark and a 10 mark, which is international relations. And then question 3 and question 4 are your interpretations. Now, I don't know if one interpretation or both interpretations will come up, but I certainly know that if you know the interpretations inside out, you almost guarantee yourself 45 marks out of the total paper. So in terms of my tips before going into the exam, know Boottown inside out, because there isn't a lot of content and it's 20 marks, and know the interpretations inside out. Watch the 2 videos that have been produced on it, because it's 45 marks. Really, international relations, the rest of the Cold War is only worth 15 marks. If you don't know something, have your best attempt at it, but it isn't going to cost you hugely. So your first question is outline. It will normally be outline 2 consequences of the Afghanistan war, or it could be outline the reasons for the growth of Al-Qaeda. It's a simple structure. Point evidence, point evidence. You don't have to go into huge amounts of detail. You'd really be looking to spend about 6 minutes tops on this question. For the explain, you're trying to go a little bit more into more detail, 12 marks, but that might be explain the causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, or explain the withdrawal of the USA in Vietnam. So I'd certainly say for 10 marks, you want to try and aim for 2 paragraphs of really good detail. If you want to go for 3, then by all means do, but if you're spending any longer than 12 minutes, you're wasting time. Now for question 3 and question 4, I don't have speakers, Miles, but thanks for your dad's advice. The reason why it's echoing is because I've got multiple audio devices for some reason, and I don't know which one I should not mute and which one to mute. So question 3 is always going to be fair comment. So you'd read through the interpretation. Is this interpretation fair comment on the Cold War? And you have to evaluate the interpretation. So the writing frame to go through is context, other historians, and factual knowledge. So as I said originally, if you're reading a source that's written in 1945 about World War II, then it's influenced by the end of World War II. If it's written in 1939 or 1938, then obviously you're heavily influenced by the start of World War II and the attempt to avoid it. Equally, if you're talking about an interpretation of the Cold War, then what you really want to be doing is looking at, is it right at the end of the Cold War when everything's going, when everything looks better because the USSR is breaking up, or is it going to be at the start of the Cold War when relations are at their worst? Try and support it with other historians that you've looked at, the 3 different or 4 different interpretations, and then support it with factual knowledge. So the writing frame looks like this, Miles and Max. And then for question 4, which is slightly different, this one you can kind of rote learn, as there's only really so many answers that could be out there. Explain why not all historians have agreed about X, Y, Z. You have to show knowledge of other interpretations. The first interpretation of sort of the Cold War is as such. Let's focus on that. The second, this differs from this interpretation because the second interpretation is this, it changed because it's disagreed, etc. You have to kind of make interconnecting points between all different interpretations. So if you take appeasement, you've got the Churchillian view, you've got, which is otherwise known as the orthodox, you've got the revisionist, the counter-revisionist, etc. That it's very difficult, Samir, to actually give practice questions for the interpretations. So the only one I can really give you is this question. So those are the 2 sources, and then you've got these questions here. Do you think this interpretation is fair? Comment on appeasement. Explain why not all historians have agreed about the Cold War, etc. So if we were going to look at these 2 examples, Gaddis, well, he's writing in 1997 after the end of the Cold War. You've got reasons for why the Cold War started. You know, he's looking back at all of the Soviet Union documents that's been released. He's looking quite negatively at the USSR and the USA. Whereas Kennan, writing in 1957, is kind of a revisionist stance. It's just before the Vietnam War, so it's not influenced by that, but they've already seen sort of an increasing threat by the USSR. The USSR now have nuclear weapons, and they're in a much more negative view of the USA at this point. So here's a model answer that I've kind of given you there that you can look at, and if you wanted to read through it and ask any questions, you can do. Here's a model answer that I've kind of given you there that you can look at, and if you wanted to read through it and ask any questions, you can do. And then the second half of the paper, question 5, 6, and 7, and 8. Germany, 45 minutes, a lot less time on that. Describe 1, then you've got an explain question, 10 marks. Explain the causes of the Reichstag fire, the consequences of the Reichstag fire. Explain the consequences of the Enabling Act. Explain why the Nazi Party increased in 1924 onwards. Explain the impact of the Wall Street crash, yada yada yada. Then the source question, you'll always get 2 sources, but you get either 2 5-mark questions or 1 10-mark question. Either way, there'll always be 2 sources, and then the 18-marker, which is your big question: how far do you agree? Now, when it says how far do you agree, it's looking for balance. It's looking for yes, I agree. However, other interpretations would be, and then a big conclusion. Yes, I agree. However, other interpretations would be, and then a big conclusion. Yes, I agree. That's exactly it, Leon. Yeah, the interpretations of the start of the Cold War really do change after the Vietnam War. There are a number of liberal historians that say the USA were far more responsible for the start of the Cold War than traditional views had originally said, and that's why it's known as the revisionist, because they're revising the view of history, and they see the USA in a lot more of a negative light, a lot more responsible for the start of the Cold War, whereas previously it had been very much, it's the USSR's fault, it's Stalin's fault, it's his to blame, etc., etc. It's the USSR's fault, it's Stalin's fault, it's his to blame, etc., etc. Any knowledge points? What do you mean, Cameron? What do you mean, Cameron? When explaining what, Germany or any 10-mark question that uses that starting kind of prompt, explain something, I'd always be aiming for a good 2 paragraphs or so for 10 marks. So to try and have really 2 substantial paragraphs that you can write in 12 minutes. I'd be aiming for as many developed points as I can. So rather than just saying, so let's take a question. So explain the consequences of the Wall Street crash. Well, if you just said businesses failed, America withdrew their loans, yeah, okay, that's 2 simple points. But what I really want to know is what was the consequences of America withdrawing the loans? You know, it's the end of the Young Plan. It means that that there's depression in Germany that allows for the growth of the Communist Party and the Social Democrats, otherwise known as the Nazis. There's a swing towards more extreme parties, and the Weimar Republic start to fall. That's the developed point. If you've done 2 of those, then you've now got a really solid answer that goes beyond simple description and into developed explanation. So that's what we're looking for 10 marks. For a 10-mark source question, Leon, let's have a look. So it would be a question like this. You could have, how similar are sources A and B? How far do sources A and B agree? Why do sources A and B disagree? Why do is source A more reliable than source B, or is source A more useful than source B? So that's your types of 10-mark questions. In terms of what it looks like, you know, this type of question, I would try and either do it as a combination, you know, 1 big paragraph. Personally, I'd split it up into 2. So if it was how useful are they, then I'd have my judgment straight away. Source A is more useful than source B because of the provenance, because of the context. I then go on to the content. The content of source A says this, that they're inferior, they're reproducing as restraint, whereas source B demonstrates that inherited defects cost 60,000 right marks. I talk about the origin, how that affects its utility. You know, is it written at the time? Is it written from a Nazi's perspective? Is it written from an Allies? Is it a piece of propaganda? Why was it written? Is the purpose? Does that affect its usefulness? And then, most importantly, is that context section. So I'd really be trying to hammer home, this is what I know, this is how much it's supported by source A, and then I'd reinforce my judgment at the end. Therefore, sources A and B are similar in their content, origin, and purpose, etc. Or source A is more useful than source B. So it depends on the type of question, but I'd be aiming for 2 really good paragraphs for a 10 mark and a little conclusion at the end that reinforces your judgment. So if it's how similar, there's your judgment in the bottom left. If it's how useful, there's your judgment at the bottom. So just to give you a kind of a structure, Cameron, Miles, etc. For that 2 mark, 1 point, nothing more. For a 10 marker, try and go for 2 peel paragraphs. For your 10 marker, try and go for 2 P's and a judgment. For your source, if it's a 5 mark, just go for 1. And then for your 18 marks, try and have 3 pale paragraphs arguing both sides of an argument and a good judgment, conclusion at the end that's solid. On to Miles's question. Stalin initially wasn't portrayed very well by the USA. So you've got the very first view, which is what we call the orthodox view. That lasts from the 1940s until about the 1960s. It says that the USSR was almost entirely to blame for the start of the Cold War, that they aggressively expanded into Eastern Europe, and of course in that period the media portrays Stalin in a very negative light. You've then got the revisionist idea from the 1960s until the 1970s. That again is influenced by the Vietnam War. It portrays Stalin in a better light. Don't forget that they had been in coalition with each other in World War II. But it blames the USA a little bit more. It still says that Stalin isn't the easiest person to go on with. It still doesn't say that he's not expansionist, because of course they are, but it places a little bit more emphasis of blame on the USA. The third view is known as the post-revisionist, where we see a lack of understanding and less blame being placed on the USSR and the USA, and that really those first few years under Truman, Roosevelt, etc., Eisenhower, is about a lack of understanding. Interpretation 4 from the 1990s onwards, is based on all of the changes that's taken place, the fall of the Soviet Union, the information that historians have been able to access, and then basically just says we can't be sure. We don't know if it's more to blame for Stalin or if it's more to blame for Truman and Eisenhower initially. So in terms of the media portrayal, and it's heavily influenced by when it's written. If you're looking at a piece of information from the 1950s, yeah, it demonises Stalin. If you're looking at the 1970s, it doesn't have that massively negative connotation. Does that answer your questions, Cameron, Leon and Miles? Massively negative connotation. Does that answer your questions, Cameron, Leon and Miles? Right. All right, if anybody has got any last questions, then feel free to type them or ask me tomorrow. I'll ask for your answers, whether you think this was a worthwhile hour of my time and your time, plus all the time to plan it, or whether you think it's a complete waste of my time and I should probably just stick to my day job, which is teaching you lessons. Have a lovely evening, ladies and gents, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow. Leon, I retracted that joke because it probably wasn't the most appropriate joke that I've ever made. Max, I can make one for the first section if you want. In fact, what I'll do is I'll sit down and tomorrow I'll write it all for it, and I can email it all to your parents if you need it, or to your email. Or if you see me Wednesday or Thursday, then I'll try and get that copy to you. Or if you see me Wednesday or Thursday, then I'll try and get that copy to you. You're welcome, Max. welcome, Max. Right. Goodbye, everybody. Stay classy. Right. Goodbye, everybody. Stay classy. Right. Goodbye, everybody.